Chapter 1. The Fate and the Frayed Edges. The village of St. Mary Mead was at its most picturesque on the day of the annual summer fête. The vicarage lawn was a riot of colour, with stalls selling homemade jams, hand-knitted scarves, and jars of honey. Children darted between the tables, their laughter mingling with the hum of conversation and the occasional burst of applause from the makeshift stage where the village choir was performing. Miss Marple sat at a corner table, her knitting, needles clicking softly as she observed the scene. To the casual observer, she was just an elderly woman enjoying the festivities, but her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. She noticed the way Mrs. Lavinia Treadway, the vicar's wife, kept glancing toward the rose arbour, her smile strained. She saw Colonel Prothero, his face flushed with irritation, arguing with Dr. James Cartwright near the refreshment table, and she couldn't help but notice young Emily Prescott, the vicar's niece, standing apart from the crowd, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. It was all very ordinary, and yet Miss Marple felt a faint unease settle in her chest. Something was amiss, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Her attention was drawn to a small commotion near the raffle stall. Mrs. Henshaw, the village busybody, was holding up a faded photograph and exclaiming loudly, "Good heavens! Where did this come from?" Miss Marple set down her knitting and made her way over, her curiosity piqued. The photograph was old, its edges frayed and its colours faded, but the image was clear enough. A group of young people, laughing and carefree, standing in front of the vicarage. Miss Marple recognised Lavinia and Arthur Treadway, though they looked much younger, and there were others she didn't know. One face, in particular, caught her eye. A young man with dark hair and a mischievous smile, his arm slung casually around Lavinia's shoulders. Before she could examine it further, Lavinia swooped in and snatched the photograph away, her face pale. "Oh, that's nothing," she said with a forced laugh. "Just an old memory." Miss Marple said nothing, but she filed the moment away in her mind, along with the strained look in Lavinia's eyes, and the way Dr. Cartwright's smirk had deepened. As the afternoon wore on, the unease in Miss Marple's chest grew. It wasn't anything she could put her finger on, just a feeling, a sense that the idyllic scene before her was a facade, hiding something darker. She had seen it before, of course. St. Mary Mead might look like a peaceful haven, but it was no stranger to scandal, betrayal, and even murder. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden commotion near the refreshment table. Colonel Prothero had knocked over a teapot, sending a cascade of Earl Grey onto the pristine white tablecloth. There was a flurry of activity as people rushed to help, but Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the small, forgotten photograph that had been hidden beneath the teapot. It was the same photograph Mrs. Henshaw had found earlier, but now it was stained with tea, the edges curling as they dried. Miss Marple picked it up carefully, her eyes scanning the faces. The young man with the mischievous smile seemed to be staring straight at her, his expression almost challenging. Before she could examine it further, Lavinia appeared at her side, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Miss Marple, please, let me have that." Miss Marple handed over the photograph without a word, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it held the key to something important. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the fête began to wind down, Miss Marple returned. To her knitting, her thoughts racing. The photograph, The tension between the villagers, the secrets they were all hiding, it was all connected, she was sure of it. And if there was one thing Miss Marple knew, it was that secrets had a way of coming to light, no matter how deeply. They were buried, the calm before the storm, she thought, her needles clicking softly. But how long would the calm last? Chapter 2. A Whisper of Poison. The morning after the fête, St. Mary Mead awoke to a grim discovery. Colonel Prothero, the village's most outspoken and divisive figure, was found dead in his study. The news, spread like wildfire, carried by the postman, the milkman, and Mrs. Bartlett, the village's indefatigable gossip. By mid-morning, the vicarage was swarming with police officers, and the villagers had gathered in hushed clusters on the green, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. Miss Marple, ever the observer, made her way to the vicarage under the pretence of offering her condolences. She found Lavinia Treadway in the kitchen, her usual composure shattered. The vicar's wife was pacing the room, her hands twisting a handkerchief into knots. "Oh, Miss Marple," Lavinia said, her voice trembling. "It's awful, simply awful. They're saying it was poison. Poison! Who would do such a thing?" Miss Marple took a seat at the kitchen table, her expression calm, but her mind already working. "Tell me what happened, my dear." Lavinia sank into a chair opposite her. "It was last night after the fête. Arthur and I were tidying up when Colonel Prothero came by. He was in a terrible mood, something about the church accounts. He accused Arthur of mismanagement, and I lost my temper. I told him he had no right to speak to my husband that way. He stormed out, and that was the last I saw of him." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And the photograph?" Lavinia's face went pale. "What photograph?" "The one you took from the refreshment table yesterday. It seemed to upset you." Lavinia hesitated, then sighed. "It was nothing really, just an old photograph from my youth. Colonel Prothero was in it, and, well, it brought back memories I'd rather forget." Miss Marple didn't press further, but she filed the information away. Memories, she knew, had a way of resurfacing at the most inconvenient times. As she left the vicarage, she encountered Dr. James Cartwright, who was leaning against the garden gate, smoking a cigarette. His expression was unreadable, but there was a glint of amusement in his eyes. "Quite the scandal, isn't it?" he said, blowing out a plume of smoke. "Colonel Prothero, of all people! Who would have thought?" "Indeed," Miss Marple said mildly. "And what do you make of it, Doctor?" He shrugged. "People die every day. Sometimes it's natural causes, and sometimes it's not. But I'm sure the police will figure it out." Miss Marple studied him for a moment. "You seem remarkably calm for someone who's just lost a patient." He smiled faintly. "I've seen enough death not to be shocked by it. Besides, Colonel Prothero wasn't exactly a beloved figure, was he?" Miss Marple didn't reply, but she made a mental note of the doctor's casual indifference. It was an odd reaction, to say the least. As she walked home, she passed Emily Prescott, who was sitting on a bench by the village pond, staring into the water. The girl looked up as Miss Marple approached, her expression guarded. "Hello, Miss Marple," she said quietly. "Good morning, Emily," Miss Marple replied, sitting down beside her. "You look troubled." Emily hesitated, then sighed. "It's just everything feels so strange. Colonel Prothero's death, all the gossip. It's like the whole village has gone mad. Death has a way of bringing out the worst in people, Miss Marple said gently. But it also brings out the truth. Tell me, Emily, did you know Colonel Prothero well? Emily shook her head. Not really. He was always so gruff, so intimidating. But I did see him arguing with Aunt Lavinia yesterday. It was awful. Miss Marple nodded. Arguments can be revealing, can't they? They show us what people are really like. Emily glanced at her, a flicker of unease in her eyes. What do you mean? Oh, nothing in particular, Miss Marple said with a smile. Just an observation. As she rose to leave, she noticed a small, crumpled piece of paper lying on the ground near the bench. She picked it up and smoothed it out. It was a receipt from the village chemist, dated the day before. The name on it was Dr. James Cartwright, and the item purchased was arsenic. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Arsenic, a common poison, and one that would leave no obvious trace. She tucked the receipt into her handbag, her mind already turning over the possibilities. The village might be in turmoil, but Miss Marple was beginning to see the outlines of a pattern. And patterns, she knew, always led to the truth. Chapter 3. The Hidden Letter. The day after Colonel Prothero's death, the village of St. Mary Mead was a hive of activity. The police had set up their headquarters in the vicarage study, and Inspector Druitt, a no-nonsense man with a sharp eye for detail, was conducting interviews with the villagers. Miss Marple, however, was not one to wait for official inquiries. She had her own methods, and they often yielded results long before the police caught up. Her first stop was the village library, a small ivy-covered building tucked away behind the church. The librarian, Miss Phelps, was a quiet, efficient woman with a knack for remembering every book borrowed and every conversation overheard. "Good morning, Miss Phelps," Miss Marple said, her tone cheerful but purposeful. "I wonder if you could help me with something." Miss Phelps adjusted her glasses and smiled. "Of course, Miss Marple. What can I do for you?" "I'm looking for information about the history of the vicarage," Miss Marple said, "particularly from about 20 years ago. Do you have any old newspapers or records that might be useful?" Miss Phelps nodded. "We have a collection of local newspapers in the archives. Let me fetch them for you." As Miss Phelps disappeared into the back room, Miss Marple glanced around the library. It was a quiet, peaceful place, but today it felt charged with tension. The villagers were on edge, and even the familiar surroundings couldn't dispel the sense of unease that hung in the air. Miss Phelps returned with a stack of yellowed newspapers and set them on the table. "These are from around the time you're interested in. I hope they'll be helpful." Miss Marple thanked her and began to leaf through the papers, her eyes scanning the headlines and articles. It didn't take long for her to find what she was looking for. The headline read, "Tragic Accident at Vicarage Garden Party." The article described a summer fête, much like the one that had just taken place, but with a tragic twist. A young man named Thomas Grayson had fallen from the vicarage balcony and died instantly. The incident had been ruled an accident, but the article hinted at rumours of foul play. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she read the names of those present at the party. Lavinia Treadway, then Lavinia Grayson, Arthur Treadway, Colonel Prothero, and Dr. James Cartwright. The photograph from the fête suddenly made sense. It was a snapshot of that fateful day. a moment frozen in time. She was about to close the newspaper when a small folded piece of paper slipped out from between the pages. It was a letter, written in a neat, feminine hand. "Dear Thomas, I can't go on like this. The lies, the secrets, it's too much. Meet me at the vicarage tonight. We need to talk. Yours always, L.A." Miss Marple's heart quickened. The letter was unsigned, but she had no doubt who L was. Lavinia Treadway had been at the centre of the tragedy 20 years ago, and now history was repeating itself. She tucked the letter into her handbag and returned the newspapers to Miss Phelps. "Thank you, my dear. You've been most helpful." Funderche, she left the library. Miss Marple's mind was racing. The photograph, the letter, the receipt for arsenic, it was all connected. But how? And who had killed Colonel Prothero? Her next stop was the vicarage. She found Arthur Treadway in his study, his face pale and his hands trembling as he sorted through a pile of papers. "Miss Marple," he said, looking up with a start. "What brings you here?" "I wanted to offer my condolences," Miss Marple said gently, "and to ask you a few questions, if you don't mind." Arthur nodded, though his expression was wary. "Of course. What do you want to know?" "Tell me about Thomas Grayson," Miss Marple said, watching his reaction closely. Arthur's face went pale. "Thomas, he was Lavinia's first husband. He died in a tragic accident many years ago." "An accident," Miss Marple said, her tone neutral. "Or something more?" Arthur hesitated, then sighed. "There were rumours, of course, but it was ruled an accident. Why are you asking about this now?" "Because the past has a way of catching up with us," Miss Marple said. "And I think Thomas Grayson's death is connected to Colonel Prothero's." Arthur's hands trembled as he reached for a glass of water. "I don't know what you're talking about." Miss Marple didn't press further, but she could see the fear in his eyes. Arthur Treadway was hiding something, and she intended to find out what it was. As she left the vicarage, she noticed Emily Prescott standing in the garden, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. The girl looked up as Miss Marple approached, her eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and fear. "Miss Marple," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I'm listening, my dear." Emily hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I saw something last night, something I shouldn't have, and I think it might be important." Chapter 4. Shadows in the Garden. Emily Prescott's confession hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with unspoken implications. Miss Marple, ever patient, waited for the girl to gather her thoughts. The garden around them was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant chirping of birds. "What did you see, Emily?" Miss Marple asked gently, her tone encouraging but not pressing. Emily glanced around nervously, as if afraid someone might overhear. "Last night after the fête I couldn't sleep. I went for a walk in the garden to clear my head. That's when I saw them. Colonel Prothero and Dr. Cartwright. They were arguing near the rose arbour." Miss Jane Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Arguing? About what?" "I couldn't hear everything," Emily admitted, "but I caught a few words. The Colonel was angry, shouting something about blackmail and ruining his reputation. Dr. Cartwright just stood there, smirking, like he was enjoying it. Then the Colonel said, 'If you don't stop, I'll make sure everyone knows what really happened to Thomas Grayson.' Miss Marple's heart quickened. Thomas Grayson's name again. This was no coincidence. And what happened then? Emily shook her head. I didn't stay to find out. I was afraid they'd see me, so I went back inside. But this morning, when I heard about the Colonel's death, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Miss Marple patted Emily's hand reassuringly. You did the right thing by telling me, my dear. These things have a way of coming to light, no matter how deeply they're buried. As Emily walked back to the vicarage, Miss Marple remained in the garden, her mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but there were still gaps she needed to fill. Her next stop was the village chemist. Mr. Pritchard, the chemist, was a meticulous man with a reputation for discretion, but Miss Marple had a way of putting people at ease. "Good morning, Mr. Pritchard," she said, her tone cheerful but purposeful. "I wonder if you could help me with something." Mr. Pritchard adjusted his glasses and smiled. "Of course, Miss Marple. What can I do for you?" "I'm looking for information about a recent purchase," Miss Marple said, her tone casual. "Dr. Cartwright came in the other day, didn't he?" Mr. Pritchard's smile faltered slightly. "Yes, he did. But I'm afraid I can't discuss a customer's purchases. Professional confidentiality, you understand." Miss Marple nodded, sympathetically. "Of course I understand, but this is a matter of some urgency. You see, Colonel Prothero's death has raised a few questions, and I'm trying to piece together what happened." Mr. Pritchard hesitated, then sighed. "I suppose it can't do any harm. Dr. Cartwright came in the day before the fête. He purchased arsenic, said he needed it for rat poison." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Arsenic, the same poison that had killed Colonel Prothero. Did he say anything else? Mr. Pritchard shook his head. No, but he seemed agitated, not his usual self. Miss Marple thanked him and left the shop, her mind racing. Dr. Cartwright had purchased arsenic, and he had been seen arguing with Colonel Prothero the night of the murder. It was a damning combination, but Miss Marple knew better than to jump to conclusions. Her next stop was the vicarage study, where Inspector Druitt was poring over a stack of papers. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his expression a mixture of respect and exasperation. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone wary, "what brings you here?" "I thought I might be able to help," Miss Marple said, her tone mild but firm. "You see, I've come across some information that might be relevant to your investigation." Inspector Druitt raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" Miss Marple handed him the receipt for arsenic and recounted Emily's story about the argument between Colonel Prothero and Dr. Cartwright. The inspector's expression grew increasingly grim as he listened. "This is serious," he said finally. "If Dr. Cartwright purchased arsenic and had a motive—" "But we mustn't jump to conclusions," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "There are still pieces missing. For instance, what was Colonel Prothero blackmailing Dr. Cartwright about? And how does Thomas Grayson's death fit into all of this?" Inspector Druitt frowned. "Thomas Grayson? Who's he?" Miss Marple handed him the old newspaper article and the letter she had found in the library. "A man who died 20 years ago under suspicious circumstances. I believe his death is connected to Colonel Prothero's." The inspector scanned the documents, his expression growing more serious by the minute. "This changes everything," he said finally. "But we'll need more evidence before we can make any arrests." Miss Marple nodded. "Of course, but I think it's time we had a conversation with Dr. Cartwright. Chapter 5. The Doctor's Alibi Doctor. James Cartwright's cottage was a modest but well-kept building on the edge of the village, surrounded by a neat garden and a low stone wall. Miss Marple and Inspector Druitt arrived just as the Doctor was returning from his morning rounds. He looked up in surprise as they approached, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to guarded wariness. "Inspector Druitt," he said, his tone polite but cool, "and Miss Marple, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "We need to ask you a few questions," Inspector Druitt said, his tone firm but not unkind. "About Colonel Prothero's death." Dr. Cartwright's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Of course. Come in." The interior of the cottage was as tidy as the garden, with bookshelves lining the walls and a fire crackling in the hearth. Dr. Cartwright gestured for them to sit, then took a seat opposite them, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "What do you want to know?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "You were seen arguing with Colonel Prothero the night of his death," Inspector Druitt said, watching him closely. "Can you tell us what that was about?" Dr. Cartwright hesitated, then sighed. "It was a personal matter. The Colonel had certain information about me, information he was using to blackmail me." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And what kind of information was that?" Dr. Cartwright's face went pale, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood and walked over to a small desk in the corner, opening a drawer and pulling out a faded photograph. He handed it to Miss Marple without a word. It was the same photograph that had caused such a stir at the fête, the one of the young people standing in front of the vicarage. Miss Marple's eyes immediately went to the young man with the mischievous smile. "Thomas Grayson," Dr. Cartwright said quietly. "He was my best friend, and Lavinia's first husband." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Go on." Dr. Cartwright took a deep breath. 20 years ago, Thomas died in what was ruled an accident. But it wasn't an accident. He was pushed from the vicarage balcony. I saw it happen. Inspector Druitt's eyes widened. "You saw it. Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I was afraid," Dr. Cartwright admitted, his voice trembling. "The person who pushed him was someone powerful, someone who could ruin me if I spoke out. So I kept quiet. But Colonel Prothero found out. He'd been digging into the past, trying to uncover secrets he could use to his advantage. When he discovered what I knew, he threatened to expose me unless I paid him." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And who was it that pushed Thomas Grayson?" Dr. Cartwright hesitated, then sighed. "It was Arthur Treadway." The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. Arthur Treadway, the mild-mannered vicar, had a dark secret, one that had haunted him for 20 years. "But why kill Colonel Prothero?" Inspector Druitt asked, breaking the silence. "Because the Colonel was going to expose him," Dr. Cartwright said. "Arthur couldn't risk it, so he poisoned him." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, I don't think so. Arthur Treadway may have a secret, but he's not a killer. There's more to this story." Dr. Cartwright looked at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and relief. "You believe me?" "I believe there's more to uncover," Miss Marple said gently. and I intend to find out what it is." As they left the cottage, Inspector Druitt turned to Miss Marple. "What now?" "Now," Miss Marple said, her tone firm. "We speak to Arthur Treadway." Chapter 6. The Vicar's Confession. The vicarage was quiet when Miss Marple and Inspector Druitt arrived. Lavinia Treadway answered the door, her face pale and her hands trembling. She led them to the study, where Arthur Treadway sat at his desk, his head in his hands. "Arthur," Miss Marple said gently, "we need to talk." The vicar looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with guilt. "I suppose you've spoken to Dr. Cartwright?" Miss Marple nodded. "He told us about Thomas Grayson, about what happened 20 years ago." Arthur sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I knew this day would come. I've carried the weight of it for so long. I don't think I can bear it any more." Inspector Druitt stepped forward, his tone firm but not unkind. "Mr. Treadway, did you kill Colonel Prothero?" Treadway shook his head vehemently. "No, I swear I didn't kill him, but I know who did." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Arthur hesitated, then sighed. "It was Lavinia." The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. Lavinia, who had been standing quietly in the doorway, let out a choked sob. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Well, how could you?" Arthur stood, his face filled with anguish. "Because it's the truth, Lavinia. You killed Thomas, and you killed Colonel Prothero to keep your secret safe." Lavinia shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, Arthur, you're wrong. I didn't kill Thomas. You did." Miss Marple's eyes widened as the tension in the room reached a breaking point. "Perhaps," she said gently, "it's time we all sat down and talked this through." As they gathered in the study, the full story began to emerge. 20 years ago, Thomas Grayson had discovered that Arthur and Lavinia were having an affair. Enraged, he had confronted them at the vicarage garden party. In the heat of the argument, Arthur had pushed Thomas from the balcony, killing him instantly. "I didn't mean to," Arthur said, his voice breaking. "It was an accident, but I was too cowardly to admit it, so I let everyone believe it was." "An accident," Lavinia nodded, her face pale. "And when Colonel Prothero started digging into the past, I knew he would uncover the truth. I couldn't let that happen, so I poisoned him." Inspector Druitt's expression was grim. "Mrs. Treadway, you're under arrest for the murder of Colonel Prothero." As the inspector led Lavinia away, Miss Marple remained in the study, her heart heavy. The truth had come out, but it had left behind a trail of pain and broken lives. Arthur looked at her, his eyes filled with despair. "What happens now?" "Now," Miss Marple said gently, "you face the consequences of your actions. But remember, Arthur, the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than a lie." As she left the vicarage, Miss Marple couldn't help but reflect on the nature of human folly. The village of St. Mary Mead might look like a peaceful haven, but beneath its idyllic surface lay secrets, betrayals, and the darker side of human nature. And yet, she thought, as she walked home under the fading light of the evening sun, there was always hope. Hope for redemption, for forgiveness, and for a brighter tomorrow. Thank you for joining me on this Miss Marple mystery. Let me know if you'd like to explore another story.